small hand slammed against the marble floor of the throne room. A guard yanked the girl up by her hair and threw her forward. She landed on her knees in front of the dais. Blood ran from a cut above her left eye. A loaf of stolen bread skidded across the polished stone and stopped at the foot of the throne. 200 silent lichens turned their heads at once. The chandeliers above swayed from the slam of the great oak doors. A woman in the front row gasped and covered her mouth with a gloved hand. The girl lifted her chin slowly and looked straight up at the king on the dais. Her lips moved. Only one man heard the words she whispered, and that man was the Alpha King Cassian. He went very, very still. "Stay with me on this one." The hall was supposed to be a celebration. The Blood Moon Gala only happened once every 9 years, and every noble lichen in the 3 packs had traveled days to be in this room. Long banquet tables ran the length of the marble floor. Silver platters held roasted boar and apples and dark wine. The torches burned a deep red color because of the moon outside. Servants in white aprons moved between the chairs and refilled the cups. Music played from a string quartet in the corner. Children were not allowed. This was a night for the old families. Cassian sat on the throne at the head of the room. He wore black from his collar to his boots. A heavy silver chain rested across his chest. His hair was dark and pulled back tight. His eyes were the color of winter sky. He had not smiled in 144 years. The nobles had stopped expecting him to. Beside him stood his second, a tall lichen named Rorik with a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. Rorik was the only person in the room who still spoke to Cassian without lowering his eyes. The two had grown up together. They had fought a war together. They had buried bodies together. Rorik had been there the night the king lost everything in 1881, and he had been the one to drag Cassian out of the burning farmhouse when the king tried to die inside it. The kitchens were 2 floors below the hall. The servants worked all night to keep the platters full. They were human mostly. A few were half-lichen but unable to shift. The work paid little but the food was good, and a human girl with no family had few other places to go. The girl on the floor was 16 years old, maybe 17. Nobody knew for sure. Her name on the kitchen roster said Elsie. No surname. She had walked up to the back gates of the palace 4 months ago with nothing but a wool coat 2 sizes too big and a small leather pouch tied around her neck. The head cook had taken pity and given her a job washing pots. Elsie did not speak much. She kept her head down. She finished her chores and went back to the small bunk room she shared with 3 other girls. She slept badly. The other girls said she cried in her sleep and called out names that none of them recognized. One name in particular. They said she called for someone named Cassian. They thought she was dreaming about a sweetheart back home. The other kitchen girls liked Elsie in their own way. They shared their bread with her. They tried to braid her hair on slow afternoons. But they noticed strange things. Elsie knew how to fold linens in a pattern that had not been used in the palace since the 1880s. She knew which floorboards in the back corridor creaked, even on her first day. She walked past the old portrait hall and named 2 of the dead kings before anyone told her who they were. One girl asked her how she knew. Elsie said she must have read about them in a book. The girl let it go. The other girls let it go too. But each of them remembered. This night in the kitchen, Elsie had taken a half loaf of black bread from a platter that was being sent back upstairs. The head cook saw her. The head cook was a kind woman, but the rules during the gala were strict. Nothing left the kitchens that had not been counted. 2 guards were called. Elsie did not run. She let them take her by the arms. She did not let go of the leather pouch around her neck. Even when one of the guards tried to pull it off her, she clenched it in her fist and would not release. They dragged her up the back stairs. They threw open the doors of the throne room. They presented her to the king. The hall went quiet. Even the string quartet stopped playing. The nobles turned in their seats. They saw a thin human girl with a bleeding face on the marble. They saw the loaf of bread on the floor. They waited for the king to speak. Cashin was already standing. He had not meant to stand. His body moved before his mind caught up. Something in the air had changed the moment the girl was thrown into the room. Rorik noticed. Rorik put a hand on the back of the throne to steady himself, because he felt it too. Old Lycans could smell a thing in the air when fate was moving. The hall smelled of it now, like a storm about to break over a field. Cashin came down the 3 steps of the dais slowly. He stopped 2 paces in front of the girl. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. Her eyes were a strange color, pale, almost gray, with a ring of gold around the iris. He had only seen eyes like that once before in his very long life. The hall watched. Nobody moved. The girl raised herself up onto her knees. She put her small hands on her thighs to keep them from shaking. She kept her voice low so that only he would hear. The whisper traveled the short distance between them and stopped at his ears. The words she said next would split his world in half. She said, "I buried your real mate in 1881. She said it was not the woman in your memory. She said the woman in the painting on your wall was never the woman you loved. She said, I know where the truth is, and the truth is still breathing under the willow tree on the old Marrowfield estate." Cashin did not move. He did not breathe. His hands at his sides curled slowly into fists. Rorik was watching from the dais and saw the king's shoulders lock. Rorik had seen Cashin kill a man for less. Rorik stepped forward to intervene. Cashin raised one hand without looking at him, and Rorik stopped. The room held its breath. The painting Elsie spoke of was real. It hung in the king's private study, on the wall above his desk. It showed a young woman in a pale blue dress, standing in a field of summer wheat, laughing at something just out of frame. Her name had been Saoirse. She had been the king's fated mate. She had died in the fever epidemic of 1881, along with thousands of others. Cashin had carried her body from their farmhouse himself. He had buried her with his own hands under the oak tree near the river. He had visited that grave every spring for 144 years. No human alive could know this. No human alive should know the name Saoirse, or the dress, or the field. The painting had been commissioned by Cashin after her death, and he was the only person who had ever modeled the image for the painter. He had never spoken of her aloud since the funeral. Rorik did not even know the name of the field. The grave had no marker. And yet this girl, this thin human girl with a cut on her forehead and a loaf of bread on the floor beside her, knew. She knew the wrong woman was buried under the oak. She knew the right woman was buried under the willow at the Marrowfield estate. And she said the right woman was still breathing. Cashin found his voice. It came out flat and low. He said, "Who told you these things?" The girl shook her head. She said, "Nobody told me. I remember them." He bent down on one knee, so his face was level with hers. The nobles in the front row stiffened in fear. The king had never knelt in front of anyone in living memory. He said, "You remember them how?" She said, "I was there. I was the one who carried her body. I was the one who chose the willow. I was the maid in your kitchen in 1881. I was the maid who served you breakfast the morning before the fever came. My name then was not Elsie. It was Myra. And I did a thing that night that I have been trying to undo for 144 years." The hall was silent. Rorik was staring. The girl reached up with shaking fingers and untied the leather pouch from around her neck. She placed it in the king's open palm. He did not look down at it yet. He kept his eyes on her face. He said, "What is in this pouch?" She said, "A lock of her hair. The real woman. The one under the willow. If you have any of your dead wife's hair left, the color will not match." Cashin rose slowly to his feet. He turned to Rorik. He spoke in a voice that did not carry past the steps of the dais. He said, "Clear the hall." Rorik did not argue. Rorik clapped his hands twice, and the captain of the guard began moving the nobles toward the exits. The nobles obeyed but slowly, craning their necks to see, whispering already. Within 10 minutes the great room was empty except for Cashin, Rorik, two trusted guards at the doors, and the small human girl still on her knees in the middle of the marble floor. The torches burned a little lower. The blood moon was directly overhead now. Through the tall windows it cast a red light across the polished stone. The king sat back down on the steps of the dais. He looked tired in a way Rorik had not seen in 100 years. He opened the leather pouch in his palm. He drew out a thin lock of hair tied with a faded ribbon. The hair was a dark chestnut color, almost black at the ends. He went very still. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat. He drew out a small folded square of paper. Inside the paper was a single lock of hair he had carried with him every day since 1881. The hair from his memory was a pale gold, almost white in the sun. He laid the two locks side by side on his palm. They did not match. They were not from the same head. They were not even from the same woman. Rorik saw it from where he stood. Rorik made a small sound in his throat that might have been a curse. Cashin sat very still for a long moment. His mouth opened slightly. His hand closed slowly around both locks of hair. He looked up at Elsie. He said, "Tell me the rest." The girl took a long breath. She put her hands flat on the marble. She said, "Not here. In the crypt." She said, "The truth is still breathing, but it will not breathe much longer. If we do not go tonight, she will be gone by sunrise." Cashin rose to his feet. He held out his hand to her. She took it. He pulled her gently up. He did not let go. A guard appeared at the door of the throne room with a silver tray. On the tray was a glass of cold water. The captain of the guard had ordered it brought, because the king had not eaten or drunk in 7 hours and the night was only half over. Cashin took the glass. He drank the water. He set the empty glass back on the tray. He sat down on the bottom step of the dais and rested his elbows on his knees. He looked for a moment, like a man on a porch at the end of a long day. Rorik brought him his coat. Cashin took it and laid it across his lap. Elsie sat on the marble beside him. She drew her knees up to her chest. She rested her cheek on her knees. Nobody spoke. The big hall was quiet. The blood moon outside slid a finger of red light across the polished stone, and for the space of 3 breaths, it almost looked like the worst was already behind them. Then the doors at the far end of the hall blew open with a crack like a tree splitting. A woman in a green riding cloak stepped into the room. She had a long bone dagger drawn in her right hand and a small bound figure walking in front of her. The bound figure was an old man in a priest's collar. His mouth was gagged. His eyes were wide. The woman in green pressed the bone dagger against the side of his throat. She said, "Cashin, step away from the human girl, or I cut his tongue out and start with him." Cashin was on his feet again before the doors had finished swinging. Rorik drew his blade. The 2 guards at the side doors drew theirs. Elsie was already standing behind the king, her small hand closed in a fist on the back of his coat. The king's voice, when it came, was not the voice he had used with Elsie. It was the voice of the most feared ruler the Lycan Kingdom had ever known. He said, "Lady Vesna." The woman in green smiled. She said, "You remember me. I am flattered." Vesna was the matriarch of the Marrowfield Pack, which had been quietly destroyed and absorbed in 1881 during the same epidemic that had taken Sersha. She had not been seen alive since the year before the fever broke out. Every record said she had died in the second wave. Yet here she was, in the throne room, with a knife at a priest's throat, and a small private army of cloaked figures filling the doorway behind her. The priest was Father Anselm, the only living Lycan priest old enough to remember Sersha's funeral and to have signed the burial papers. Cashin understood, in a single black second, that the lie was bigger than one woman. The lie was a whole pack. The lie was institutional. The lie went all the way down to the parish records and the council seals and the very throne he sat on. His chest was a cold weight. Pride was no longer the question. Survival was, and not just his own. The little human girl behind him was the only living witness who could still speak the truth, and Vesna had not come here to talk. Vesna walked the priest forward 5 paces and stopped. She said, "The girl belongs to me. She has been hiding from me for a long time. Hand her over. I let the priest live. I leave your hall. We never speak of any of this again." Cassian moved Elsie slightly behind his back. He said no. Vesna's smile did not change. She said, "Then you will lose more than you can imagine, Alpha King. You have already lost more than you know." Rorik advanced 2 steps with his blade up. The cloaked figures in the doorway raised crossbows. The priest's eyes leaked tears. Cassian held up one hand to stop Rorik. He turned his head slightly toward Elsie. He said, "Lo, the crypt. Now, can you find it from here?" Elsie nodded once. She said, "There is a passage behind the dais. It runs under the east wing. I know the way." He said, "Then run." Cassian shoved Elsie backward toward the dais. He drew the long silver blade from the sheath at his hip. He stepped into the open floor between Vesna and the girl. Rorik moved to flank his left. The 2 side guards moved to flank his right. The cloaked archers in the doorway loosed their first volley of bolts. The torchlight flickered. The blood moon poured red light through the high windows. If you are still with me through what comes next, hit that subscribe button, because the next part is what the whole story has been pointing toward. Cassian deflected the first bolt with the flat of his blade. The second bolt struck Rorik in the shoulder. Rorik did not fall. Rorik roared and surged forward and cut the bow arm clean off the nearest archer. The man went down screaming. The other archers backed up 2 steps. Vesna pressed the bone dagger harder against the priest's throat. A thin red line opened on the old man's skin. Cassian did not slow. Cassian crossed the marble floor in 3 long strides, lifted the silver blade high, and brought it down. Vesna stepped back at the last possible moment, and the blade struck the marble where her boot had been. Sparks flew. The priest stumbled forward, dropped to his knees, and crawled away as fast as his old body would allow. He was free. Vesna laughed. She said, "You are slower than you used to be." Cassian said, "I have not needed to be fast." He swung again. Vesna parried with the bone dagger. The 2 blades rang off each other. Rorik tore the bolt from his shoulder and threw himself at the archers in the doorway. The 2 side guards followed. The big hall filled with the sound of metal and the smell of blood. Elsie had reached the dais. She was on her knees behind the throne, feeling along the back wall for the catch on the hidden passage. Cassian and Vesna circled each other in the open center of the floor. He said, "Why?" She said, "Because Saoirse was not the rightful maid of the king. Myra was. Myra was the kitchen maid, and the kitchen maid was the one fate chose. We could not allow a human servant to be queen. So we substituted Saoirse. We arranged the fever to take Myra. We told you the body in the field was the woman you loved. We have been the council behind your throne for 144 years. You have ruled 3 packs because we let you. You have never been Alpha King. You have been our puppet." Cassian's voice came low and very even. He said, "Saoirse." Vesna said, "Saoirse was one of ours. Saoirse was a Marrowfield cousin. She wore the blue dress because we told her to. She walked through the wheat field because we told her to. The painter you hired had been ours for years. The face you have grieved for a century and a half was a stranger to you in every way that matters. The only true thing in that painting was the field. And the field was not even hers. The field was Myra's. Myra used to walk through that wheat at sunrise to bring you bread. We knew you would not forget the field, so we let you keep the field. We took the woman and gave you another. We let you bury her under the oak so you would have a grave to visit. Every spring you have laid flowers on the head of one of my cousins. You have called her by Myra's place. You have wept for the wrong woman. And we have laughed." Cassian's face did not move. His eyes did. His eyes burned a hot, bright gold for the first time since 1881. The torches in the hall flared up at the same moment. Rorik, fighting near the doorway, felt it on the back of his neck and grinned in spite of himself. The cloaked archers felt it too and backed away from Rorik. The king was finally awake. Cashen moved. The silver blade flashed twice. Vesna parried the first strike. She could not parry the second. The blade caught her across the back of the wrist, and her bone dagger fell to the marble with a clatter. She stumbled back. Cashen advanced. He pressed the tip of the silver blade against the hollow of her throat. He said, "Where is Myra?" Vesna's smile finally cracked. She said, "Under the willow." "Where the girl said." Cashen said, "Alive." Vesna said, "Barely. The fever did not kill her. We put her in a long sleep. We have kept her there for 144 years. We were waiting for the next blood moon to wake her, because she is the only one who can sign over the bloodline to one of ours. If you go to her now, she will wake when you say her name." And the whole council falls. Cashen heard the catch click behind the dais. Elsie had found the passage. She was waving for him. Rorik and the guards had cleared the doorway. The remaining cloaked figures had dropped their weapons and were running. The big hall was almost empty again, except for the bodies and the blood and Vesna on her knees in the center of the marble. Cashen did not kill her. He pressed the blade harder. He said, "Rorik, bind her." Rorik came forward with rope from a fallen archer and tied Vesna's wrists behind her back. Cashen turned away. He ran for the dais. Elsie was already in the passage. He followed her in. The hidden corridor ran under the east wing of the palace, then under the old chapel, then out beneath the gardens. It ended at a heavy iron door set into the wall of the old Marrowfield crypt. Elsie pushed the door open. The smell of cold stone and old earth rolled out. A single torch burned on a bracket inside. The willow tree above the crypt had grown its roots down through the stone ceiling, and the pale roots hung like ropes in the cold air. In the center of the chamber was a long stone slab. On the slab was a woman. Cashen stopped in the doorway. He could not move. Elsie went past him and knelt by the slab. She brushed the dust from the woman's face. The woman was small and thin. Her hair was a dark chestnut, almost black at the ends, the same color as the lock in the leather pouch. She wore a simple linen dress. Her hands were folded across her chest. She was breathing. Very, very slowly. Once every minute, maybe less. Her chest rose and fell. A faint pulse moved at the side of her throat. Cashen crossed the chamber. He knelt on the other side of the slab. He looked at the face he had never seen in any painting. He looked at the small chapped hands he had never held. He felt, for the first time in 144 years, the bond. The mate bond. Quiet but unbroken. Steady, like a string between his chest and hers, drawn tight. He whispered her name. He said, "Myra." The woman on the slab did not stir. Elsie said louder. Out loud. "Like you mean it." Cashen leaned closer. He put his hand over Myra's folded hands. He said her name again with his full voice. "Myra." The torch flickered. The willow roots above shifted. Myra's eyelashes moved. Her lips parted. She took one full breath. Then another. Her eyes opened. They were the same strange pale gray, with a ring of gold around the iris. The same eyes Elsie had. The same eyes she had passed to her younger sister, the kitchen maid who had run for 144 years, carrying her sister's truth in a leather pouch around her neck. Myra looked up at the king. She did not look afraid. She did not look surprised. She said, "You are late." Cashen made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and lowered his forehead onto the back of her hand. Sunrise came slowly over the gardens of the palace. The blood moon sank below the east wall, and the sky turned the pale gray of early morning. Myra sat on a low bench in the gardens, wrapped in Cashen's heavy black coat. Elsie sat beside her, the leather pouch finally untied from her neck and resting in her lap, light for the first time in a long, long life. Cassian stood a few paces away, talking quietly with Rorik. Rorik's shoulder was bound. The priest, Father Anselm, was sitting in a chair near the stone wall, drinking warm tea and crying without sound. The two side guards stood at the gates. Inside the palace, the council chamber was being emptied of records and seals, and the long false history of 144 years. Vesna was in a cell beneath the palace. 3 of the elder council had already been arrested. By the time the sun cleared the east wall, the rest would be in chains. The 3 packs would learn the truth by noon. Some would not believe it at first. Some would. Within a week, the throne would have to answer for the lie, and Cassian would answer for it himself, because he had been the lie's most useful tool, even though he had not known. He would not hide behind ignorance. He had decided that on the walk back from the crypt. Myra drank slowly from a small cup of broth. Her body remembered how to swallow. Her body remembered how to be warm. She looked across the garden at the man she had loved before she was put to sleep, and she saw the same man, only older in the eyes. She said to Elsie, "You kept your promise." Elsie said, "I told you I would." Myra put her hand on her sister's hand. The 2 sisters cried quietly together for a few minutes. Then they wiped their faces and watched the sunrise. Cassian came over after a while. He sat on the stone bench beside Myra. He did not speak for a long time. He looked at his own hands. He looked at the sky. He looked at her. He said, "I am sorry I did not find you." She said, "You found me." He said, 144 years late. She said, "You are here." He took her hand. She led him. They watched the light come over the wall. Later that morning, when the palace was awake and the news was beginning to move through the streets, Cassian walked alone to the old oak by the river. He knelt in front of the unmarked grave he had visited every spring for 144 years. He said, "I do not know your name." He said, "I am sorry I called you by another woman's name for so long." He said, "I will find your people. I will bring you home." He laid the pale gold lock of hair on the grass above the grave. He left the dark chestnut one in his coat pocket. On the walk back through the willow grove, he stopped once and rested his hand against the trunk of the old tree above the crypt. He said, "Lo, thank you for keeping her." The branches moved in a small wind, the way branches do. He took that as an answer. He walked back to the palace. Myra was waiting for him at the gate. Elsie was beside her. Rorik was on the steps with a clean bandage on his shoulder and a small, tired smile on his face. The cook came out from the kitchen with 3 bowls of warm porridge on a tray and would not be sent away until each of them had taken one. The kitchen girls came out behind her, holding the door, watching their friend Elsie with new eyes and no questions. Father Anselm walked slowly across the courtyard to bless the gate, his old voice steadier now. The morning was bright and quiet and ordinary, the way mornings are after the worst night of your life. Cassian took Myra's hand. He took Elsie's hand. He walked between them up the steps of the palace, into the long work that came next, and the heavy doors closed behind them as the bells in the chapel began to ring. The Lycan kingdom would never be the same. Neither would he. But the bond, that small steady string between 2 chests, held. And for the first time in 144 years, the Alpha King Cassian believed it would hold for the rest of his life.